Yeah, I was going to say, I thought it was good that you put the tweet out that you did because we have the audio now. National Archives put out the audio. I could be wrong. In fact, after your tweets went out, I went kind of trolling back through one of the books that I thought was going to give me the direct answer, and I couldn't find it. But I could be wrong. But I believe the audio has not been available since it's been 31 years since the Air Force did that investigation, the Project Mogul investigation, which of course they compile 900 some pages worth of documentation on, and then they slap the word Roswell on the front and they call it basically, call it a day, say we solved the case. But I do not believe the audio has been available for all these many years. And so it's very important. And as you found, I mean, you put the audio side by side with the transcripts that they printed, and you might find there's a little bit of context that's missing from the plain letters on the page. There's laughter. There's, you can gather a lot from the tone of voice as they talk about someone, and you definitely get a sense of just how they treated this as nonsense. So I think it was good that you put out the tweet that you did, because we've got the audio now, and even though the stuff has been on transcripts for 31 years now, you get to learn a bit more about it.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic drew their plans against us.
All of a sudden, a stick out of nowhere landed right in front of us, and there was no tree, nothing overhead. Something threw it at us.
Yeah.
All Things Unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
This week, the National Archives released a trove of UFO files, including some tied to the Roswell incident of 1947. In these files, I discovered two major bombshells. First, a recorded moment where Air Force officials mock legendary UFO researcher Stanton Friedman, a moment missing from the official transcript, and second, audio of officials discussing efforts to bypass FOIA and hide key documents. Now we're breaking it down with the help of my friend, Paul Simones. You can find him at Paul Tiberius on X. He's from the Roswell UFO tour. He's the real Roswell expert. And we're going to bring him on to talk about these tweets and what led to the vetted episode from one of the tweets after this commercial with CJ. And remember, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, comment, and share it. And we really appreciate you. If you're listening on a podcast platform, please subscribe. If you're listening on an audio podcast platform, please follow us and subscribe and leave a 5-star rating and a review. We really appreciate it.
All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounce's books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show.
All right, right on cue. I'm bringing in Paul Simones, the real Roswell expert on the ground in Roswell, New Mexico. He does the Roswell UFO tours there to help explain the major players involved in these recordings and why this matters in the grand scheme of Roswell's history. Paul, thanks so much for joining All Things Unexplained on short notice.
Absolutely. It's good to be with you, Dr. Mounts. You are, as always, too kind. I hate to call myself an expert in anything. The more you study something, the more you realize you don't know.
Well, it is the unexplained, but you're putting the work in there. I mean, you're putting it in. You do the UFO tours, and everybody owes themselves the chance to go out there and do the UFO tour with Paul. It is an amazing experience. And so we had an interesting week here, Paul. We had the U.S. National Archives release, unexpectedly, by the way, some UFO UAP files on us.
Yes, and their website basically hates humanity.
That's the truth.
I wanted to download a whole document of the 509th Bomb Group, the various morning reports, and then a whole archive of their on-base newspaper, which was about 197 pages. I got to a point where my computer was so cloggy, I was only downloading about 4 pages per minute. And of course, you have to download every single one individually. And I wanted to scream. In fact, I probably was screaming. I recall my dog looking at me kind of like all scared, like I was mad at him or something.
Well, I was trying to go through those files on my iPhone, and holy cow, it was essentially impossible. I knew I wasn't going to get much done until I got on my computer, at least anyway. And if you want to peruse those files, despite how massive and hard to sort through they are, we'll have the link in the show description down there for you, as well as the links to everything else, including the Roswell UFO tour with Paul. But Paul, how about we start with this first one on Stanton Friedman? It involves Stanton Friedman. And the transcript for this interview had actually already been put out, but it's only just now that we seem to have gotten the audio of the interview. And I'm going to put up on screen the tweet we made. If you haven't followed us on Twitter yet, check us out. We're at AT Unexplained. And here's our tweet. Breaking newly released Roswell interview audio reveals omitted mockery of the late Stanton Friedman by a U.S. Air Force officer. A declassified audio-only recording from the National Archives release captures a 1994 interview between Lieutenant Colonel Sheridan Cavett and Colonel Richard L. Weaver, who was the author of the Air Force's official Roswell Report in 1995. Cavett's wife is also present during this recording. Now, interestingly, the transcript of this interview, Paul, it appeared in the U.S. Air Force report on page 164, and I put the link that in the tweet. But the newly released audio has a glaring omission from the transcript, and I think we should just play that audio for everybody now. And I actually have the transcript up where you can follow along. So here's the audio from that section right here.
What the date on that is? A letter from Doyle. It says, when you call a press conference, tell the world, let me know I want to be there. So, I've just got reams of this stuff in books.
Do you mind if I look through that real quick?
Oh, heavens no.
See, I've
from that nut up in Freeburg,
Stanton T. Friedman
or whatever.
Yeah, he doesn't like me a lot. He writes me
called me a couple of times. One time I could hear him a little bit, but it wasn't good enough for me to try to strain my brain. So he apologized in a letter he wrote me back. Said, sorry we had a bad telephone connection on your end.
Paul, I don't know about you, but I find this audio kind of appalling, to be honest.
Well, what's amazing is that's only the second time I've heard it. The first time I listened to it was on your tweet. And I was standing outside, and I wasn't sure if he said that nut. When I listened to that just now, I'm pretty sure that's exactly what he did. Cavett did not want to hear any more from these guys. when you look at the reporting from Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt on their meetings with Sheridan Cavett, and this even goes back to earlier when I believe Bill Moore was the first person who found Sheridan Cavett. Cavett absolutely straight up lied to these guys, saying, "Nope, I was never in Roswell. You got the wrong man." He wanted nothing to do with this whole business. And of course, Cavett, the reason why he gets interviewed, the reason why he's important, is because he's the other guy who went with Major Marcel out to the ranch, following along behind rancher Mac Brazel, the first people to go out to the debris field site once Brazel had come to town with his report. I should say the first military people, because I think there's plenty of clues that fellow ranchers and maybe even folks in Roswell had heard the scuttlebutt and gone out and taken a look at what was out there. So Cavett's extremely important. And when he's first found, he wanted to have nothing to do with this investigation. He literally lied, according to the reporting from the researchers who talked to him. And then he's calling Stan Friedman that nut.
Yeah. You know what else is interesting? And I didn't mention this in the tweet, but they did put this part in the audio, which I don't know who Doyle is. Do you know who Doyle is? He said he has a letter from Doyle.
Yeah, that's Doyle Reese. And I'm racking my brain. I believe he's another counterintelligence person who was, if I recall correctly, I do not believe he was ever in Roswell. I think he might have been somewhere up the chain of command ahead of Captain Cavett. At the time, it was the Counterintelligence Corps, which had a separate reporting chain of command from the ordinary Army Air Force. So Captain Cavett, while stationed at Roswell, did not necessarily report to the commander of Roswell, Colonel Butch Blanchard. His chain of command went up to another base in the Counterintelligence Corps, which later became the Air Force Office of Special Intelligence, Air Force OSI. So if I recall correctly, I'd have to go back and look. I believe Doyle Reese was in his chain of command or a fellow CIC agent, not someone involved in Roswell. I could have that wrong.
But I bet you don't.
I hate being that way.
Well, no, I mean, look, it's hard. It's hard to keep up with even these few people that we've got involved in this situation. But of course, that's why I've got you on, because you're incredible with Roswell information. You're definitely the man to go to for all this. And I think it's just so wild. You know, it makes me want to do the face palm. Like, really? They really want us to believe what counterintelligence people is telling us? It's almost an oxymoron, in my opinion, that we're listening to counterintelligence people. But anyway, he gets a letter from Doyle. Yep.
Yeah, give me 1 second. Let me clarify this. Could be important. You can edit this out.
Oh yeah, the magic of podcasting.
I grabbed the only Roswell book that was immediately next to me, and it did not have it, but it'll be in Witness to Roswell, I'm sure.
Well, you did better than me. You knew Doyle was probably their first name, and I just assumed it was their last name.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've got that right. Actually, he was above Cavett in the chain of command, but he was not at Roswell.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, he was up at Kirtland, or whatever. I don't know if they called it. I don't know if they called it Kirtland Army Airfield in 1947, or if Kirtland is the name assigned to it, the base in Albuquerque after the Air Force comes into existence. That I don't know.
Well, to me, it's interesting. I didn't mention it in the tweet, but it's interesting how Doyle, who writes Cavett a letter, they just casually joke, when you call the press conference to tell the world, let me know, because I want to be there. Pretty intriguing, right? So they're basically saying, hey, when you call the press conference to tell the world about the aliens or the UFO, the flying saucer, let me know.
Yeah, so I think And obviously I wasn't there. I mean, when these conversations are happening, I'm a freshman in college. Actually, I probably haven't even entered college yet. So I wasn't involved. I don't know all these people. But I believe Doyle Reese was somebody that Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt and Tom Carey were trying to use to basically crack the nut of Sheridan Cavett, trying to get him as an old compadre to convince Cavett to go ahead and talk. Randall and Schmidt and Carey have all reported the stories of how Cavett's family has suggested there were things that he knew that he went to his grave with. Colonel Doyle Reese, same thing from his family. These were at the time, the counterintelligence men in 1947. Cavett is a man who's on the ground at the Brazel debris field. And here's what's so important about Cavett. And I got to be careful because this might be a little somewhat sensationalized just on my part, right? But Cavett is the guy who goes out with Major Marcel and the rancher on that Sunday after the rancher first comes in. And Cavett refuses to talk for years. When the Air Force does their investigation in 1994, where they do all this digging into Project Mogul, they're not interviewing the men who served on the base in Roswell who might have something to say about the events. They interview all kinds of guys who were involved in Project Mogul, but they don't bother to interview anybody who was in Roswell except Captain Sheridan Cavett, the counterintelligence man who literally went with Marcel and the rancher to go see the debris field. And basically, and this is where I kind of am putting my own sort of paraphrase and spin onto what Cavett had to say. Basically, Cavett said, "Oh yeah, we went out there. I knew it was nothing but a weather balloon as soon as I saw it." Cavett also says he never met the rancher, according to his memory. He's not even sure he went out with Major Marcel. He claims that he's a little, his memory wasn't too good on that point, which means that his story, the only one the Air Force bothered to collect from men who had been at Roswell, is that Cavett goes out through the bewildering landscape of Lincoln County out to the debris field site, which you've driven, you know it. He goes through that bewildering landscape, having only been in Roswell for about a week at that point. He's never traversed this land. He's not familiar with this land. He's only been there for about a week. And he goes out there to the debris field site on second-hand verbal directions alone. And he doesn't go out and find a 3/4-mile-long field strewn with debris. He finds a 20-foot square bullseye with one little tinfoil radar target sitting in it, and he's back home in time for dinner. That defies all plausible, all belief. You cannot believe that tale. If you've spent any time going out there to the ranch, out into that land where the debris field was, you know how bewildering it is. You come to a watering tank and there's 7 cattle trails meandering off in every possible direction. Imagine I'm giving you verbal directions on how to get to a place. And I say, yeah, when you get to the 3rd watering tank, take the 2nd cattle path from the furthest north direction, and then follow that on about 3 miles over 4 hills and 2 cliff faces, and then you'll be there. But what if you take the wrong cattle trail?
Exactly.
But anyway, Cavett, who'd never been out there, who didn't follow the rancher, he goes out there, picks up this little thing in hundreds of square miles of land, finds a bullseye 20 feet across, and is back home in time for dinner. That's what we're supposed to believe. That's who you're listening to call Stanton Friedman that nut.
And of course, Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist turned full-time UFO investigator, highly respected amongst his peers, both UFO buffs and skeptics alike. And I wonder, Paul, and maybe you know, how much interaction did Stanton Friedman actually achieve with people like Cavett and Weaver? Because it sounds like, Weaver says, yeah, that being Friedman doesn't like me a lot. He writes me nasty letters. I mean, that's really interesting there. I've never heard anything like that about Friedman before, but I wonder how much interaction Friedman managed to get with these two.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, the thing was, it was very obvious that Colonel Weaver was in charge of this investigation right at the beginning, and what's UFO researchers were sending the Air Force research materials saying, "Look into this, investigate this. Here's a witness. Incorporate that. Give some investigation into Colonel Thomas Jefferson DuBose." Only the third individual who actually appears in the first batch of photos taken in General Ramey's office. You got Major Marcel, you got General Ramey, you got Colonel Weaver. Colonel DuBose. Why not dig into Colonel DuBose's record? See what he had to say. See what the rest of his career was like. But they just weren't interested. They barely mentioned DuBose at all. DuBose is a guy who sat there in the room with the stuff. We have pictures of him there at Fort Worth Army Airfield. And he talked to UFO researchers as a retired Air Force brigadier general, saying the weather balloon was a cover story. And they don't bother to give his testimony any credence. I believe, I could be wrong, I believe that General DuBose was in his 90s and may have actually already passed away when Colonel Weaver starts his investigation. Not obviously, you can't blame him that he didn't interview the guy. But he could have at least given some consideration to what this man had to say and look into his background and treat it the same way that he treated Blanchard and Marcel and everybody else.
Yeah, and they even have a good laugh about Stanton Friedman here. And rest in peace, by the way, Stanton Friedman passed away not that long ago. And, I mean, it's just real interesting here that, first of all, this is missing from the transcript. And in my opinion, it's quite audible where Cabot asked Weaver, "Hey, have you heard from that nut?" And he also calls him by the wrong name. And I get the sense he even says it on purpose. I think he calls him Friedberg or Freeberg, right, instead of Friedman. And, I mean, it's just very suspicious.
I'm pretty sure the official Air Force transcript misspells Friedman too. Hang on, I'm looking across at but I've got my reading glasses on. Yeah.
Oh, they did. It's Friedman, Friedman, and the official transcript even spells it Freidman. I did not notice that. So that's a good catch. And of course, I also found it. It was also interesting, and his wife, Cabot's wife, was in the interview. And if you listen to the full audio clip in this new release from the National Archives, MC, which is in the transcript, that stands for Mary Cabot, she chimes in quite a bit in the interview.
Well, if I recall correctly, there's some point where, and I'm paraphrasing here, she basically pipes up and says to her husband, Sheridan Cabot, "Say, honey, remember that time we were all over at the Marcel's house and you and Jesse were out in the backyard with a piece of that thing trying to get it to burn?"
Yeah.
Where's that piece?
At the old Roswell barbecue that nobody was invited to. And nobody remembers. He actually plays pretty coy about that, if I remember. He's kind of like, "Well, honey, I mean, I don't remember about that necessarily."
Oh man, I need to listen to that because there could be a lot of subtext in his voice that does not come across in the transcript. That could be really, really important. I mean, obviously it's all up for interpretation, right? This is a subjective analysis. But there will be a lot more. There will be a lot more there when you get to actually hear his voice and hear the whatever pauses there may be where the transcriptionist applies a comma, right? You can tell we human beings, we know each other, right? We know what sounds our mouth and throats make when we're trying to come up with a plausible excuse, right? or when we are expressing doubt as to the accuracy of our own recollection. That comes through in vocal inflection. So anyway, yes, I have not had a chance to listen to this whole thing. I was really excited when you texted me out of the blue saying that this was out there.
Yeah, and there was another character, and I can't remember his name, but Cavett was talking about how nice of a guy he was, but Cavett basically called him a dunce for all intents and purposes. Yeah, but the wife, Mary, talks about how intelligent he was, how he loved to read. And Cavett, he just kept going back to this thing where, yeah, he would take road trips and read books at the same time as he was driving on the road trips. He just kept talking about that. And he was constantly saying, this guy, he's not all that bright. But the wife was like, yeah, he's really intelligent. But Cavett was like, well, he is a really nice guy, So there is a lot of subtext here. I mean, really interesting counterplay between Mary Cavett and Sheridan Cavett. So
yeah,
Paul,
that's happened more than once in the Roswell body of testimony, where the wife is sitting there and piping up and adding interesting things that are just like, well, what are we supposed to do with that little piece of information that she just threw out there?
I highly suspect, too, that they probably ran this transcript back by Sheridan Cavett before it got approved for release. Maybe not, but it does seem, it's kind of conspicuous how the derogatory comment about Friedman and all the laughter, too, right? Like, I know they can add, context into transcripts about people laughing and that sort of thing, but interestingly, none of that's in there.
One thing about the transcripts that the Air Force produces is that they're not quality transcripts. They're not being produced by, with the same level of caution that a court reporter is going to do. She's not capturing every single thing. I want to mention to people, this is a book that I came across not too long ago, actually, because the author was on a Kevin Randall podcast, one of his last episodes of A Different Perspective with Kevin Randall. Anyway, the guy's name is Greg Lawson. He's got a military career. He's got a police investigation background. He writes Roswell, the After Action Report. He was involved a little bit with sort of the principal researchers over the years. And he's got a really interesting take on the overall Roswell case. He kind of boils it down. He says, I'm not going to get bogged down into all the details of this witness gave this fact, which was supposed to have happened on this date and interacted with this fact over here. He's like, I'm not going to get into the arguments. We're going to look in sort of big picture style at what some of these key witnesses say. We're not going to look at all of them. We're just going to take some of the important ones. And he was the one who really kind of turned me on to the importance of Colonel DuBose's testimony, the one who's right there in the photo, a literal retired Air Force general who agrees to go on videotaped record and tell UFO researchers, look, the story that you see in those pictures is not the real story. That's hugely important. So anyway, but one thing that Greg Lawson does in that book was he really points out the shoddy way that the Air Force transcripts are produced. In the interview in one of the interviews, Lieutenant at the time, James McAndrew, one of the investigators, and one of the other more senior investigators are together interviewing one of these principal witnesses. I think it actually might have been Charles Moore, who you also tweeted about. And instead of the transcriptionist saying who's asking the question, it just simply says question, answer, question, answer. It's not capturing the verbatim of a conversation between multiple people. I sat in depositions. I gave something like 30 depositions over the course of about 5 or 7 years during a stretch of my career. I would be questioned by multiple different attorneys. The attorney on my side of the case would pipe up with an objection or an instruction or whatever. And a proper transcription captures the name of the individual speaking. And they just blow right past it. They don't even care. And the other thing in the audio clip of the one of Charles Moore that you put, your tweet, the Air Force investigator actually says, which now this doesn't turn out to be true, but he actually says, no, we're not. We're only going to put official documentation in this report. Like, for example, this interview we're doing now will not appear, but your affidavit will, because that's official documentation.
Right.
Now, obviously, somebody came back and said, no, you can't do that. We need to go ahead and put these transcripts out, or we're going to be accused of this, that, and the other thing. And so they do. But just the fact that they were proceeding under the assumption that we're going to try to be as transparent as possible. Well, hello, do or do not. There is no try. You're either transparent or you're hiding stuff. I mean, you're already going to produce a 1,000-page report on this thing. Why not? Why not include everything that you find? Unless there's specific redactions that, certain rules of privacy or whatever you're going to do. Anyway,
well, and as we found out this week, the notion that there was a lack of transparency is not just a conspiracy theory. Indeed, with this new National Archives release of UFO UAP files, we find out it's a fact. There was cover-up, there was obfuscation, there was attempt to avoid release of information and documents. And speaking of the tweet, this tweet kind of set a lot of things in motion this week, including an episode of Vetted. So our friend at Patrick on Vetted Podcast, check them out on YouTube. Give him a subscribe at Vetted Podcast. He did an entire episode kind of based on this tweet, which was real interesting because Paul and I had been talking about the context of that tweet. And I wanted to make sure I talked to him, got his input before I put anything out there, because I didn't want to put it in the wrong light. And he's definitely the man to know about the Roswell incident. Let's take a look at that tweet that kind of set some things in motion here this week. Again, this is at our Twitter at AT Unexplained Breaking. 1994 Roswell audio reveals covert efforts to evade UFO disclosure laws, also known as FOIA or Freedom of Information Act. A newly released audio-only recording from June 8, 1994, captures the U.S. Air Force interviewing Professor Charles B. Moore, physicist and meteorologist who played a key role in Project Mogul, at his dining table. In the clip, Moore references Robert Todd, a persistent Roswell researcher known for his sharp criticism of the UFO community. Todd was seeking to communicate privately with Air Force officials in a deliberate attempt to circumvent FOIA protocols, an effort to stop documents from being released to UFO buffs. Moore also reveals that Colonel Duffy kept significant material stored in his basement, documents presumably never seen by the public. Let's listen to that audio now between Moore and an Air Force official interviewing him. And just like you were saying, Paul, I'm not sure it identifies who is actually conducting the interview. Quite strange, but here's that audio.
Did he prefer you not give us copies of all this information?
Right, he's dug up the things with Colonel Duffy, and he wants to be sure that they don't get released to the other UFO buffs or the UFO buffs. I think he's not one under Freedom of Information. So I think he's willing to have it transferred to you as a private communication.
I see.
I think Colonel Weaver promised that he could arrange it so that it would not come under Freedom of Information disclosure, which may be odd for Todd to be asking, but I thought you'd find that of some interest.
Well, we're in report.
Time out. We're hearing this from Moore, but Colonel Weaver is...
I just noticed that too.
Colonel Weaver is approving of the notion that he could accept some material in his official government duties in such a way that it's exempt from public disclosure, which comes from a private citizen. This is not Robert Todd's personal medical records here. This is documentation that Todd presumably is digging up on Project Mogul and one thing or another, and he wants to donate it to the Air Force and let them incorporate it into their investigation, but he doesn't want it to get out to the rest of the UFO community, and it seems that Colonel Weaver is okay with that.
And I'm glad you brought that up. This is the same Weaver that we were just listening to, right? That
so they are
author of the Roswell Report.
They are talking about Colonel Weaver, yes, the lead investigator of the Roswell Report. Colonel Weaver wrote his own book here just a few years ago that is very worthwhile. I have not finished it, actually. I mean, I've skimmed it through multiple times, but in terms of a hard page-by-page read, I haven't finished it. He might actually talk about this moment. I don't know. But, wow. Yeah, just the notion that Charles Moore... Do we need to talk about who Charles Moore is? He's kind of important.
We're definitely going to let's start this audio over again. Let's finish this audio, and then let's break down who these players are.
Did he prefer you not give us copies of all this information?
Right, he's dug up the things with Colonel Duffy, and he wants to be sure that they don't get released to the other UFO buffs or the UFO buffs. I think he's not one under freedom of information. So I think he's willing to have it transferred to you as a private communication.
I see.
I think Colonel Weaver promised that he could arrange it so that it would not come under freedom of information disclosure, which may be odd for Todd to be asking, but I thought you'd find that of some interest.
Well, the end report that we're going to write is going to be based on official records and essentially transcripts such as this. So there'll be a lot of things like Cabot's tape. The transcript will not be part of that. This statement,
but the summary will.
The statement will be.
Can I make a suggestion? If you remember, there was a note in there from Dave Atlas to Colonel Duffy, a copy of a letter, I think, there. And Dave mentioned somewhere or another that Colonel Duffy took him down in his basement, and he had Colonel Duffy had trunk full of documents that were unclassified. I wonder if it would be possible for you to contact Mrs. Duffy, who...
I was wondering about what she might have.
Well, I think she may have a great deal.
Paul, where do we start? Who's Charles Moore? I guess we could start there.
Charles Moore was involved in Project Mogul. Project Mogul is the big balloon train experiments that are going on in mid-1947. And in June of 1947, after they have attempted, I believe, 3 times, they've attempted to launch these giant balloon trains 3 times from the East Coast, New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And they have so many problems that they wash their hands of it, they give up, and because it's an Air Force project, the Air Force says, all right, we're going to send you guys down to Alamogordo, big open skies, good weather, and you can launch all the balloons you want down there in New Mexico. And so they decamped to New Mexico in early June of 1947, 1 month before the Roswell incident. Professor Charles B. Moore is, I forget what his title is, but he's essentially like the lead graduate student engineer from the New York University that is actually doing the legwork on putting these balloons together, flying them up, collecting the data on behalf of an Air Force project. Charles Moore was located in the earliest days of the Roswell investigation by Stanton Friedman and or his research colleagues. And Charles Moore is actually mentioned 40 plus years after the fact, actually 30 plus years after the fact, he's mentioned in that first book, The Roswell Incident, where Stan Friedman and or his research colleagues put some information out, the way the material has been described, of what was recovered. They asked Professor Moore, so what do you think this is? Could it be one of your balloon experiments? And he's like, well, the way they describe it, no, it sure couldn't be. I don't know what that would be. And they kind of leave it there. Now, fast forward 15 years, and I think Charles Moore is a little bit miffed that he's been represented in basically the pro-Roswell side of things. And so when this official Air Force investigation comes out, Charles Moore is very eager to give all of his balloon data to the Air Force so they can use it to build their Project Mogul case. Project Mogul was a real thing. If you just read the Air Force report from 1994 as a fan of engineering projects and read all the reports on Project Mogul, it's a fascinating problem. You know, I mean, the whole point of Project Mogul was to put a bunch of balloons into the upper atmosphere and get them to stay at a certain altitude so that the payload they are carrying could have adequate dwell time at altitude. The payload was microphones, and the purpose was to try to listen to the mythical or the hypothesized reverberation that would carry around the globe if an atomic bomb was detonated in the Soviet Union. Now, in June and July of 1947, apparently they do have some maybe somewhat classified microphone technology. It's a little confusing to me, but that may just be my ignorance. But they are apparently doing some preliminary microphone work. But for the most part, they're just trying to figure out, how do we get a balloon train to fly up to 80,000 feet and stay there? That's a mechanical engineering problem. And they have these little dribblers. They have little ballast canisters on the balloon train, and they're trying to work out all these automatic mechanisms that will allow it to dispense ballast if the thing ever starts to drift down in altitude and then correct itself. So it dumps off ballast like a hot air balloon so that then it can rise back up into the air and maintain its own altitude. That is the engineering challenge they're working on. And Charles Moore is right in the middle of it. And he has a major position of responsibility for that project in 1947. Now he seems to be really invested, deeply invested in making people believe, including Jesse Marcel Jr., making people believe that the only thing that fell on Mac Brazel's land, the only thing that caused the Roswell incident, was one of his balloons. He goes out of his way to try to create to bolster that argument and
yes,
to meet with witnesses and show them, look, here's a tinfoil radar target, guys, a Raywind target. This is all you found. This is what it is. Handle it. And the interesting thing is Jesse Marcel Jr., who was a 10-year-old boy when he handled pieces of a flying saucer on his mother's kitchen floor, Jesse Marcel Jr. is the only witness to the case who handled both the real material, whatever it was, and a Raywind target decades later, which had been used in Project Mogul. He had physically handled both, and he said, I'm sorry, these are not the same thing.
Right.
So anyway, so Charles Moore, he was deeply involved in this whole thing. And he gets deeply involved with the Air Force during the years of the investigation. There is a very intriguing comment a few years after this audio that we just played, where a British UFO television producer by the name of Tim Shawcross is here in Roswell interviewing witnesses. And he's literally here in Roswell. He sits down with Walter Haut, interviews Walter Haut. He interviews Glenn Dennis. He interviews a whole host of people who were prominent in the case in the 1997 timeframe. And he gets a chance to talk to Charles Moore too. Tim Shawcross writes his analysis, his book, in a very straightforward manner. He gives both sides an airing on any controversial issue. And it doesn't break new ground, I would say, but it's one more different lens on the same kind of cluster of witnesses, and you get some interesting looks. And here's the interesting thing that maybe does slightly break new ground, is that as his book was going to publication around 1997, he tries to call Professor Charles Moore once again, get a clarification on something. Moore, and I believe the interaction goes something like this. Moore basically spills the beans accidentally that the Air Force is putting together a second report. The world does not know this yet, but somehow Professor Charles Moore does. He knows there's going to be some more work coming out from the Air Force because the Air Force knows that their first report didn't answer all the questions and put this whole thing to rest. And so they have to do a second report where they're going to go on to all the bodies and the test dummies, that whole thing, in 1997. Professor Charles Moore, according to Tim Shawcross, knew that was coming before the world did. So how tight was he with the Air Force people?
Seems like pretty tight. And, one thing this clip does, I think it at least confirms that it is not Weaver doing the interview.
No. We know that. I think the transcript identifies who the interviewees are, or the interviewers are, but there's two of them because it's McAndrew and a more senior colonel, I believe,
okay,
who are both there. But the transcript isn't going to tell you who's asking, which one of them is asking a question.
Right. Annoying. And at one point, Professor Moore mentions Robert Todd, and it's this Robert Todd that wants to convey some documents to the Air Force privately in a manner so as to not be subject to FOIA. Who is Robert Todd?
Well, he was a UFO researcher who's passed away now, who if you can read some of his documents, some of his newsletters and things, and he just got really, really bitter about the whole Roswell thing. He was, I think the world needs debunkers. I don't think the world needs angry, bitter debunkers, and I think that's what he became. But he died years ago. Obviously, I never knew the man. I can't talk, personally about him. But when you read his work, that definitely comes out.
Was he ever out there in Roswell that you know of?
I don't know. But Robert Todd successfully got the National Personnel Records Center to hand over Major Marcel's entire personnel file, minus his medical records, back in the, early 90s. I think he was the first UFO researcher to get them in as much length and detail as he did. So he was doing some work trying to puzzle out the case, but he was a big debunker of the whole thing. As he describes it, he got into some very unpleasant interactions with Jesse Marcel Jr. Just over the phone, just real vitriol back and forth between them. But the interesting thing is that as much as Robert Todd took he could take a sarcastic tone to things in his writing until it just went over the top, and it was just bitter. It was just bitter and name calling. And he ends up having what I think is sometimes termed the Pizza Summit. He ends up hosting Lieutenant James McAndrew, who I believe has just been promoted to captain, who was writing the second Air Force report on the Roswell incident, called the Roswell Report, Case Closed. James McAndrew ends up coming over and hanging out with Robert Todd in his basement, and they have some pizza and beers together during the conduct of this investigation. Here's the thing. I don't really have a problem with if the Air Force wanted to be friends with everyone, have good relationships with everyone, sit down and honestly hear the perspectives of people on all sides and take their advice on where maybe they should look. Because these guys doing the Air Force investigation have, weeks or months of looking into the Roswell case, while these other people have years. Other people on the outside can definitely point you in the right direction. But they didn't. They didn't honor agreements to do things with the pro-Roswell researchers. Just for example, the interviews and things that the researchers handed over to the Air Force saying, this is our copyrighted material now. but we would like you to use it. Please, use it judiciously, and then send it back to us. Well, guess what? Then it ends up in the National Archives, and it's on YouTube,
Yeah.
which UFO researchers don't exactly appreciate.
Right.
But here's the deal. If you're going to buddy up to somebody, you ought to buddy up to somebody on the other side as well, just to be able to get another perspective on what you're doing. And here's where that comes into play. When you go through the 1994 Air Force report, there is, at the very beginning, a flurry of instructions sent out to all the various offices within the Air Force, telling them to search their documentation for any hidden records that might be responsive to this investigation that we're performing, having to do with Roswell and the flying saucers. Well, guess what? One of the Air Force libraries uses as their search term for the time frame of 1947 unidentified flying object. And they even use as a search term UFOs. Guess what? That term didn't exist in 1947. It's invented by I think Ruppelt actually may be the one who invents it, although it's UFOBs tends to be how it's used at first. It doesn't get invented until around 1952, after the wave of flying saucers over the nation's capital and Project Blue Book is formed. There is no UFO in 1947. No one has come up with that acronym yet. And yet that's what the Air Force is looking for. Okay, this is why if you're going to buddy up to people on the outside, try to do it in both directions, right? Get somebody with the invested, steeped knowledge in the UFO topic to be able to tell you, guys, hold on, hang on a second there. Kenneth Arnold didn't take off and see his flying saucers in May. He saw them in June. Oh, don't go looking for UFOs, because they didn't invent that term until 5 years later. Why don't you look for flying saucers? And be sure you look for flying discs as well, because that was the first thing that a bunch of newspaper editors started calling them. And you better spell disc both ways, with a K and with a C. If you're going to do a word search, do it right. And that doesn't hurt anyone. That's not biasing the investigation. It's keeping the investigation on a realistic track.
Right.
And they didn't do that.
Well, why was Todd so bitter? Why do you think he got like that?
I don't know. I do not know enough about him. I have a very narrow view on him, having read a whole bunch of his newsletters that he wrote as he was trying to investigate Major Marcel's military record and his, the veracity of his statements. So I started reading a lot of that material pretty closely because I've been compiling a huge dossier on all the different fine little details of Major Marcel's life and when he offered testimony and to whom and who wrote about him when, so that we can have a timeline of when various facts of his life emerge and start gaining currency in the UFO field. So that's why I was reading Robert Todd's stuff. I don't know enough about him. Don't know his background, don't know the rest of his work and the other things that he might have looked into. So,
well, it is interesting. It would be great, to have more facts around how or why did Todd get involved with more in such a way so as to pass along that Todd had information that he wanted to send to the Air Force as well, but off the record, so to speak. Like, that's really intriguing to me.
You know what's intriguing? Look back at that transcript of the clip that you did. Professor Charles Moore says, Robert Todd wanted to find a private way to give this material so it wasn't subject to FOIA, and we understand Colonel Weaver apparently promised there was a way to do that. And then what does Moore say? As odd as that may be for Robert Todd to request a thing, that's the way things stand. Wait, whoa. As odd as it may be for the colonel in charge of an Air Force government investigation to promise such a thing. That's what should be causing the astonishment as Charles Moore refers to it. Not that, it's very odd that Robert Todd would ask for this. So anyway, it just, there's all these buddy relationships that I don't pretend to know how to untangle. I'm pretty sure there are some authors who have delved into this in some detail.
I get the sense that we have some assets of some sort involved in all this, right? Like more than just citizens. As I was looking through the JFK files, it became obvious that our reality was filled with CIA assets, right? So it only makes sense to me that some of these figures involved in the Roswell incident and this whole story were assets of some sort of the military, CIA, FBI, somebody. Or maybe not.
Well, I'm just kind of kicking it around in my head. What if Professor Moore and some of these other folks were being prodded to go out there and sort of be the front men for this alternative explanation? See, I don't know. I'm not going to go that far. My pet theory on the whole thing is that there was enough knowledge of Project Mogul resident at Roswell that they knew it would be a perfect excuse to get the local populace off the scent, to give a credible alternative explanation to the locals who are already trading in the rumor of a crashed flying saucer. Come out and say, nope, there was no flying saucer. It was one of those big balloon trains you guys have been seeing flying over the skies. Which means they had some interaction with Project Mogul at the time, which means they knew exactly where to go to get some of those tinfoil radar target kites. One to smash up and throw on the floor in front of Major Marcel. One, I suspect, that they threw on a table in front of the rancher and handed him a tape measure and told him to start memorizing. Just my little theory there. So I think there was a connection to Project Mogul, its highest leadership in the moment of the Roswell incident. That's the thread that's my working hypothesis. A relationship between Project Mogul deliberately and the cover-up that is enacted at Roswell. Is Charles Moore 40 years later recruited into that to basically push the simple narrative that it was a cover-up of Project Mogul rather than the other way around? I don't know.
Well, like you said, he could have been bitter himself. And he mentions, speaking of Mogul, this Colonel Duffy.
Yes.
Is hiding or has all these documents in his basement.
Here's the thing.
Who's Duffy? What does Colonel Duffy have to do with all this?
Duffy is basically, and I don't, off the top of my head, I can't perfectly recall what the chain of command is and what his role is going to be. But I believe he's essentially, for all practical purposes, going to be the boss in charge of the entire Project Mogul operation. There may be a couple of individuals between him. There may be somebody up above him. And there's a little bit of confusion, at least in my memory, because the leadership of the project changed a couple of times. There was a guy who was deemed to have been completely ineffective at getting the project off the ground and moving, and so he gets canned in favor of somebody else. I just don't recall where Duffy fits into that whole mix, but that's all out there. Anybody can pull up the Roswell Colonel Weaver's report from 1994, and that's all described inside there. But Colonel Duffy is in the chain of command directing the Project Mogul effort. Everything, this entire interview with Professor Charles Moore is a discussion relating to Project Mogul, trying to dig up more information on Project Mogul. Why are they so deep into this? Because Project Mogul at some point was in fact classified. Some of its documentation, at least. Not all of it. And so they're trying to dig deeper and to find everything they can. Why? Because they are mightily invested in convincing the world that it was Project Mogul that caused the Roswell incident. But to do that, they have to find some missing Project Mogul flight. They have to find some hidden piece of Project Mogul to make an explanation for Roswell's stick. Eventually they do. At least they think they do. They find flight number 4. Flight number 4. Project Mogul flight number 4, which launched on June 4th, allegedly, and disappeared after heading straight for Brazos land. Disappeared over the horizon. And that is what they hang their hat on, and they say that must be it. That must be what fell on Brazos land. Here's the problem. There's not one shred of documentation to say that Project Mogul flight number 4 ever flew. There is one shred of documentation to say that something flew on June 4th, but it was not the scheduled flight number 4. Now, June 4th, this is 5 weeks before all of the Roswell excitement in the headlines. 5 weeks, okay? So if flight number 4 is your answer, then the stuff that you see in the pictures of Major Marcel posing with the tinfoil trash had to have laid out on Brazos land undiscovered for 5 weeks. I ask a simple question. When you look at those photos, where's the dirt? Right. But anyway, flight number 4. Here's the thing. If Colonel Duffy had a trove of his own personal collection of documentation on Project Mogul hidden in his basement, and I don't know, I don't know what the status of that ever was. Maybe it was found, maybe it's known, maybe I don't know. They're talking about it as an unknown thing in 94 in this audio. If he had a trove of extra information in his basement, wouldn't it be interesting if it said flight number 4 did not fly? What about flight number 3.5? Nobody talks about Project Mogul flight number 3.5. When you read Albert Crary's diary, which is the only shred of documentation that we have mentioning something potentially flying on June 4th. He's one of the Project Mogul scientists. He kept a handwritten diary. Think of how important that is. What if Colonel Duffy had one in his trunk in his widow's basement, right? Nobody ever talks about the fact there's a flight number 3.5. It's not called 3.5, but when you do the math, you realize, wait a minute, there's another flight there that no one ever talks about. Wouldn't it be good to know what happened with that one? And then there's all the clues in Professor Moore's testimony, where he talks about how the tinfoil radar target, the Raywind target, that silver thing that's laying on the floor at Major Marcel's feet in those photos, they learned through experimentation that their best bet was to fly somewhere between 3 and 5 of those targets if they wanted good tracking on radar. I'm speaking as an engineer. I'm speaking now as someone who has designed test projects, as someone who, before you run test number 1, you run a whole bunch of test number 0s that you're not documenting. You're just flipping on your instrumentation and drive around the circle and make sure it's all collecting data. That's not recorded. That's just instrumentation checks. Okay, well, they would have had to do the same thing with these tinfoil radar targets if they ultimately arrive at the conclusion that they need somewhere between 3 and 5. How do you arrive at that conclusion? Because you launched a balloon flight with 1 and you tracked it on radar. And then you launched a balloon flight with 2 and then you tracked it on radar. And then you launched one with 3 and you launched one with 4 and you launched one with 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. And then you looked at all your data and you realized we only need between 3 and 5. How many tinfoil radar target kites get flown up into the atmosphere in the Roswell vicinity or the Alamogordo vicinity? And how many of them drift towards Roswell and come down wherever, hither and yon, so that they're very commonplace and people see them? Well, I don't know. But wouldn't it be amazing if in Colonel Duffy's widow's basement there's a box that describes some of that activity?
That would be amazing. Unfortunately, I bet we'll never know if these interviewers followed up on that lead or not. And certainly if they did and whatever they found, hey, is it out there somewhere? we may never know.
Well, or we may. This is one of those things that is, I think it's an unknown known. The answer is going to be known. Somebody knows the answer.
Right.
You and me sitting here, we don't. So
we don't
maybe
know
we'll
yet.
do. Hey, let's do this next week after I do a little bit of digging around, and I'll bring you the box of the Colonel Duffy documents. Right?
I mean, it could be in the National Archives release. You never know. I mean,
Maybe so. It takes you 5 minutes to download a single page, though. So, I mean.
Yeah. I mean, you're only going to be, 150 by the time you get to the answer. So we'll just keep plugging away. We'll keep digging. Well, I really want to thank my special guest, Paul Simonis. You can find him at the Roswell UFO Tour in the one and only Roswell, New Mexico. And Paul, I would like to get your final take on where does this information that we've turned up from the National Archives, where does it fit into the overall Roswell narrative? Why is it important? And also tell us a little bit more about the Roswell UFO Tour.
Sure. Well, it's important because the Roswell case for 30 years since the first Air Force report has been mired in this argument where the two sides say, on the one side, the only thing that fell on Brazos land was a few pounds of balloon trash. And everybody had to jump through hoops to protect Project Mogul. And on the other side of the argument, you have these people with, I think, excessive claims about exactly what the alien spacecraft looked like, exactly how many beings were on board, exactly what planet it came from, blah, blah, blah. Those two extremes are too extreme for the average critical thinker to navigate between. What we need is a simpler question, a threshold question that we need to address and we need to answer. Was this or was this not an event that involved something bigger than a few pounds of balloon trash? If it did, if we can prove that it did, then all this Project Mogul stuff is just nonsense, because that's never what it was. That is I think, a very narrow kind of question that we need to ask, we need to answer, we need to search for the documentation, we need to find what I think of as a holy grail sort of piece of documentation, such as a grandma's diary or a photo surreptitiously taken from down 2nd Street, and there off in the distance is a convoy, military convoy with some Jeeps blocking off the road and a thing covered with a tarp driving down. And through forensic analysis, you can determine that's from approximately the summer of 1947. Imagine if we find something like that, something lurking here in this town where I live. Then we can get somewhere, right? Because then we're not arguing between these two ridiculous extremes that are so far apart they can't even see each other across the chasm. Then we narrow the question down. And if we can reach a essentially universally agreed upon answer that it was about something bigger than a weather balloon, then we go forward and we find our answers. All the Project Mogul stuff, on the one hand, it just shows there is this extraordinary, insistent effort on the part of the government. We must convince the people there was no Roswell incident and it was just this balloon stuff. Why? They don't do that with Kecksburg. They don't do that with Aztec. They don't do that with Kingman, Arizona. They only did it with Roswell. Why? That's perplexing. So the Project Mogul stuff, it's important because it forces us to use some critical thinking skills and to take a sympathetic eye to the history of the time. I don't simply want to cast all of the Project Mogul guys as a bunch of villains who are trying to steal our fun flying saucer story.
Right.
I want to also recognize that the guys working on Project Mogul, to a large degree, were a bunch of World War II veterans who served their country, who came home after the war, and as a part of the GI Bill, they get to go to college And because of their experience, they're brought into an Air Force-sponsored project that is using the resources of a university to conduct these experiments. And they did their best with a challenging project that eventually, after 2 or 3 years, went nowhere and was canceled. Did they advance our knowledge? I don't know. I don't know. I don't think we're using anything that they found, but it was an honest attempt to do a thing that was important at its time, and it's now being used, manipulated to insist that Roswell was something very, very mundane that just defies common sense. So I don't know. I think it's important to do, and I think it's important to study the Project Mogul documents on their own, in their own light. Let them speak for themselves, and don't, immerse yourself just in the project of the time. I did that about a year ago. I found it really rewarding. And it's only when you do that certain realizations in relation to the Roswell case start to come to light, such as they didn't care about these tinfoil radar targets. They were not one iota of the effort and of the difficulty they were going through to try to make the project work. It's all a bunch of misdirection. And chances are, there were no tinfoil radar targets on the flights that were alleged to have taken place, that were alleged to have fallen on Mac Brazel's land. The evidence that flight would have had tinfoil radar targets is the thinnest of gruel. It's no evidence at all.
And you know what I've always found to be completely stretching credulity is this notion that Cavett and others would go out to the debris field for the first time and that they would not document it in any way whatsoever. No photography, no sketches, notes, nothing. And Paul, I think you make such a great point about the things that could still be out there, because I think that information has to still be out there too. And there's no valid reasons. I mean, I guess you could say, well, they stowed it away because of Mogul, but then why is it still missing? I mean, it made no sense that, hey, they would not at least document going out there and what they saw.
Yeah, I mean, ask the question. After a 4th of July holiday weekend, after 3 days potentially away from the office, everybody comes back on to the Roswell Army Airfield. They've got to get back into the swing of things. And suddenly the top 2 staff intelligence officers of the world's only atomic-capable strike group drop what they're doing and go chasing a rancher's tales of strange tinfoil on a half-day's journey away. What, they couldn't send a couple of corporals to go check this thing out, take a few pictures, come back, and then they can make a decision on what to do beyond that? No, these Major Marcel and Captain Cavett personally drop what they're doing from all their other duties and go out on that lengthy drive out to the ranch. And they document nothing for posterity?
Yeah, I'm not buying it. Doesn't make any sense to me. Doesn't make any sense at all. Well, I tell you what, it's been a real pleasure having Paul Simonis with me tonight. Now for the real exciting part. Paul, tell everybody how they can meet you in person on a Roswell UFO tour.
Well, come to Roswell. Better yet, make your plans before you come to Roswell. The longer in advance you make a reservation to take the UFO tour, the easier it is just for me to plan my various days, because I have other things to do, not just giving the tour. So go to RoswellUFOtour.com. You will see I've got tickets available right now all the way out through the end of July, I believe. Soon I'll make additional tickets going into the later summer and fall months available too. There's 3 typical times per day that tours run. That does not mean all 3 of them run every single day, but you can get on the website, pick your day anywhere between now and the end of what I have available for sale, and buy your tickets right there. I'm looking to work up a deal with Groupon that would allow you to buy a private tour depending on how many people you decide to bring with you. Might turn out to be a discount. It might not. But the advantage is it would be private. And so you might have a little more flexibility if by chance you wanted to, perhaps, if it works out, let's say walk inside a famous house with a certain famous kitchen. That happens from time to time. If you want to literally stand in the exact physical location where the bodies were examined, and usually when I do a private tour, that's where we do something maybe a little off the beaten path. That's maybe where my curiosity gets piqued by something, and I'm like, you know what? There's nobody around. Hey, let's go see what's over there. So a little bit of a process of discovery occasionally unfolding. That's happened a number of times, and we've gotten to do some interesting things. Just kind of, hey, nobody's looking. Let's go see what's inside that building, and it's kind of cool.
Well, we got to get those private tours going. I know we've got a lot of listeners who would be up for that. So, Paul, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I got to have you back on in the near future. I want to find out more about this mortician, because there's quite a bit from the mortician in Roswell in these U.S. National Archives releases, including some very interesting audio that I pretty much can't decipher. So, as soon as I told Paul, like, hey man, look what I managed to enhance the audio on, this cool interview with the mortician from Roswell. And sure enough, as soon as I told you that, I basically have not succeeded in enhancing any of the rest of that interview whatsoever. I mean, it's so weird, right? You talk about the transcripts being all messed up. Some of the interviews are completely inaudible. You cannot understand. It's almost like they had the microphone in another room, or they covered it up with something. It's completely unintelligible and inaudible. There's no way there's a transcript of it anywhere. If there is, I would love to know how they deciphered it.
Yeah, that interview with Glenn Dennis. Now you mentioned that, I suddenly wonder if it was one of those submissions from a UFO researcher.
Could have been.
Yeah, because he said it was from like 1991, and I'd have to go look. There was a documentary being produced back then. Who was doing that? Mark Wolf, somebody like that, I think. I wonder if that's involved. Anyway, yes, we could get into that. I never met Glenn Dennis. I cannot tell you anything about him beyond what I have read and you have read, but we can certainly chat about it. And hey, look at this. I thought we were just going to get on and talk about 2 tweets for 15 minutes. Here we are, an hour and a half later.
We knew what was going to happen.
It's almost midnight your time, man.
I know, so I still got to put this together. So let me let you go. I may have something breaking for you. I am going to try to keep enhancing the Dennis interview. There's multiple ones on there, but really they're just, I don't know, I might have to get some new software or something. Like, I thought I had it made because I enhanced that first part, and now, boom, like nothing else. It's like completely garbage, nothing. So we'll see. I'll let you know as soon as if I manage to get anything out of it. But thanks, Paul. Short notice. I really appreciate you. I'm going to try to push this out tomorrow. So let me let you go. And
that's good.
Wish me luck.
Good seeing you. I can't even talk now. Good seeing you, Tim. Dr. Mounts. Thank you. Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. Have a good night, Paul.
All right. See you, brother.
All right. See you. These newly surfaced audio clips show just how much of the Roswell story was edited From officials discussing hiding documents outside of FOIA to completely scrubbing derogatory remarks about researchers from the record. It's clear the Roswell legacy is still being shaped not by what's revealed, but by what was deliberately left out. Be sure to check out our original post on X for the full story and watch the vetted podcast Great Breakdown linked in the show notes. Follow us on YouTube at All Things Unexplained and on Twitter at AT Unexplained, and subscribe wherever you're watching or listening to us at. Please give us a rating, 5 stars, and a review. Like, comment, share for more breaking coverage of the mysteries that they don't want you to know. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the most important part of the story is the part you're never supposed to hear. Thanks, everybody.
All Things Unexplained.
What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the Alaska.
We do.
Okay.
Dr. Taylor was revealed to be the chief scientist of the UAP task force with the Pentagon.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.